What is, in your opinion, the biggest butterfly effect ever? Enjoy watching and write in the comment, what is the biggest butterfly effect for you? Story 1. Elian Gonzalez. His mother and her boyfriend took the 5-year-old on a boat trying to get from Cuba to Florida. They were caught in a storm and Elian's mother died. Elian was found in an inner tube 5 miles from Florida. He was taken to a hospital, and then a legal battle began about whether to keep him in America or send him back to Cuba. The Attorney General, Democrat Janet Reno, ordered that he be returned to his father in Cuba, but the family holding him refused. This eventually led to federal agents taking him by force. The Cuban-American community was outraged by this. Over 80% of Cuban Americans voted for Bush, which was significantly higher than usual. Much of this was attributed to their anger against the Democrats for returning Elian and the way it was handled. Bush won Florida by 537 votes out of millions cast. It is very likely that Elian changed history. Without him, there would never have been a second Iraq War. The makeup of the Supreme Court would be radically different. Bush started our massive deficits, which have never turned around. He spent like crazy while cutting taxes. When asked about it, his vice president responded with, "Deficits don't matter." Story 2. The Fall of Constantinople. The Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453 was a major turning point in history. It ended the Byzantine Empire, which had been a center of Eastern Christianity for centuries. The Ottomans then controlled trade routes between Europe and Asia, which helped to shape the development of the modern world. Story 3. Personally, maybe a butterfly effect, maybe a series of rolling good luck. I moved to a tiny mining town in Western Australia from central Queensland to live with my then boyfriend. My first job there was at a cafe that banked with the tiny credit union there. I snagged a maternity leave cover job at that credit union, which eventually closed its branch. The credit union was used by the only medical center in the tiny town, whose principal GP I got along with really well while I was there. Because of this, I snagged a job with the medical center. When my relationship ended, I moved back to QLD and in with my brother, instead of back to CQ like I planned, where I got with my now partner. Within 2 weeks, I had a job at a hearing clinic, which I never would have applied for if I had found another job in a medical center. When we had our first baby, I wasn't able to work full-time at the hearing clinic anymore, and my boss recommended me for a job at one of the medical centers that we rented a room in to do hearing testing. My boss at the medical center had to take some medical leave after I had just gotten back from my maternity leave for my second baby, and she was freaking out a little about having to take that much time off. I told her I would take over while she was on leave. This led me to being permanently made 2IC after her return. I still work here now. Basically, learning to make coffees and tuna melts lead me to a job I love and a family. Story 4. Have you heard of the butterfly effect? According to it, a different flapping of a butterfly's wing in the past will cause unexpectedly large events centuries later. There is a real-life example of this phenomenon from recent history. 1976. Din Muhammad Kunayev's rule in the Kazakh SSR, Valentin Karpovich Mesyats, the secretary in charge of agriculture, asked for permission, saying that he had not gone on vacation for a long time. Kunayev joined him and sent another party worker to Cuba, who was well acquainted with Fidel Castro. A mosquito bit Mesyat's penis while the party workers were relaxing on the famous Varadero beach. They immediately treated and cleaned the wound, but the area was swollen. After returning, each of them went to Kunayev one by one and gave a report. Mesyats entered first. He was shy and told what happened. Kunayev was embarrassed and could not laugh. When the second employee went to Kunayev and gave a report, the head of Kazakhstan heard the incident from his own language and asked for a laugh. "I wonder what else happened there." "Nothing, Dimash Akhmedovich. We met Cuban friends, drank rum." "I'm not saying it. You understand what I mean?" And looked meaningfully at his employee with a smile. The employee's mind went elsewhere and became excited. "No, nothing worth saying. Just small talk. Say don't be shy." When you say that, Valentin Karpovich didn't say something nice once. He said that the leader's wife should not interfere in the administration of the republic. That is, he meant Zuhra Sharapovna, Yalimova, Kunayev's wife. Kunayev was in a hurry because he expected something completely different. Then he took the employee out and remembered this. A few weeks later, Mesyats returned to Moscow from Kazakhstan to the position of Minister of National Economy of the USSR. In 1978, Fyodor Davidovich Kulakov, a member of the Politburo who was the secretary of the CPSU Central Committee for Agriculture, died. Instead, the files of the 2 candidates were brought to Brezhnev. One of the candidates was Mesyats. Brezhnev called Kunayev and asked, "Mesyats worked for you. What do you say about him?" 99% reliable person, Leonid Ilyich, answered Kunayev. "Yes, why not 100%? Surprised Brezhnev. because sometimes he speaks against the first, that is, against the leader, but with a little work on it, there is no better candidate. Understood, said Brezhnev thoughtfully, and said goodbye to Kunaev. Then he put Mesyats's folder aside and signed the documents without checking the second candidate's folder. The second candidate was Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev, first secretary of the Stavropol Regional Committee of the CPSU. Source. Story 5. There is a myth saying Pyrrhus was killed by a woman throwing a pot from her window. Pyrrhus more or less enabled the original rapid expansion of the Roman city-state, and we all know how that ended, and the influence the empire had on the world. Also, it is entirely possible Pyrrhus would have won, and then returned across the ocean to claim Alexander's throne. Probably not right. But who knows? I love it anyways, and portray it as a fact, calling it the pot who made the world. Story 6 and 9/11s happened all because a guy made a wrong turn. In 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was visiting Sarajevo with his wife Sophie. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was not popular in Sarajevo, and a group called the Black Hand, likely funded by the Bosnian government, planned to assassinate the Archduke. Ferdinand and his wife were in a motorcade in an open-top car. The group threw bombs at the motorcade but missed and took out one of the other vehicles in it. Instead of getting the Archduke out of there, he went on to his engagement. Afterward, he decided that he wanted to visit the police officers who were hurt in the hospital. The Archduke brought his own personal driver, who did not know his way around Sarajevo, and the driver ended up taking a wrong turn. He stopped the car in front of the cafe, and sitting outside the cafe was Gavrilo Principe, a young member of the Black Hand who was involved in the assassination attempt. He was distraught, thinking that they had failed in their attempt, and he went to this cafe to have a sandwich. To his amazement, the very man that he had attempted to assassinate pulled up right in front of him. He pulled out his gun and shot both the Archduke and Sophie. In retribution, Austro-Hungary declared war on Bosnia. A series of treaties pushed all of Europe into war. 3 years later, in 1917, due in large part to the instability that was being created in Russia, a group known as the Bolsheviks seized power and deposed the Tsar, eventually murdering him and his family, the Romanovs. After World War I ended, Russia seized territory in neighboring countries, forming what would be known as the Soviet Union. In 1918, World War ended with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. In the treaty, Germany was forced to take all the blame for the war. They had territory seized, they were not allowed to form an army, and they had to pay reparations. This, combined with the Great Depression, crippled Germany financially. Taking advantage of a weakened Germany, Adolf Hitler, himself a veteran of WW1, eventually rose to power. In defiance of the treaty, he re-established German armed forces and invaded neighboring Poland, Austria, France, etc., kicking off WW2. The Allies, of course, went on to win WW2, and the Soviet Union began claiming additional territories, kicking off a period which will be called the Cold War. It was called the Cold War because the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union never fought each other directly, but fought satellite conflicts like Korea, Vietnam, and in the 1980s, Afghanistan. The Soviet Union occupied Afghanistan, but a rebel group known as the Mujahideen was fighting back against the Soviet Union. The United States began arming them in their fight. Eventually, the Soviet Union was forced out of Afghanistan, but the damage had been done, and most adult Afghan men died on the battlefield, leaving behind an unstable country with no command structure and no schools. Rather than staying behind to help stabilize the country and set up a government, the United States pulled out of Afghanistan, allowing the Taliban to take power. At this point, a young, up-and-coming thinker, educated in the United States, resentful of the U.S. presence in Saudi Arabia, and based out of Afghanistan, began gathering his own fighters. Osama bin Laden would go on to form Al-Qaeda, who were responsible for multiple terrorist attacks, the largest of which was 9/11. Now it could be argued that in 1914, Europe was already itching for a war. It was a time of empires, and they all wanted land that the others had. Europe was a powder keg, and if it hadn't been for the assassination of the Archduke, something else would have led to World War I. But the fact is that the Archduke was assassinated, and that's ultimately what led to the chain of events that followed over the next 100 years. And just think about everything that has happened since 9/11. We are still feeling the reverberations and likely will for another 100 years because every cause has an effect. Story 7. My dad is a die-hard alcoholic, always was. But there was a time when his alcoholism saved his life. In 2005, on the Red Lake Reservation in MN, Jeffrey Weiss opened fire on his classmates. My dad worked at that school, in particular with the troubled kids, or the bullies who were too disruptive to have in class 24/7. That day, though, my dad went home early to drink and play Burnout Revenge. I was told that Jeffrey either went to my dad's room or threw it either way. That whole situation has always stuck with me. Almost lost my dad, but was saved due to his want for alcohol AMD games. Story 8, a personal one. When I was 14, I bought my first gram of weed from my friend's older sister, who originally got it from a guy friend of hers. After that, I became a stoner, and when I first got into high school, my friend and I skipped class one day and went to go look for locker 420 because, of course. We ran into this guy in the hallway. He had a cool metal band jacket on, so I started chatting him up about finding this locker. He walked around with us for a bit, but we couldn't find it. So he left. Didn't get his name. Never saw him again. A year later, my other friend is on-off with some guy and sets us up as a joke. We actually hit it off and stayed together for the rest of high school. We eventually figure out we're friends with a bunch of the same people, including my friend's sister who used to sell me weed. He then tells me he used to get weed for her, and it was likely his weed that I bought. We then put together that he was the guy I was looking for the 420 locker with the year prior. So if I hadn't bought weed off my friend's sister, I probably wouldn't have been such a stoner so young. And I wouldn't have made the new friends that I did in high school, and I wouldn't have been set up with said stoner friend's ex, who was the one who technically sold me the weed in the first place. And we've been together for the last 13 years now. Story 9. Not biggest, but biggest that impacted me. Back in high school, I used to get a ride home from a friend when it's really hot out. This was pretty much every day in the summer. One day my friend couldn't give me a ride because they're going to an Air Force recruiter's office for a meeting. I really didn't want to walk home in the heat and said I'll tag along. Friend didn't get recruited, but I did. The recruiter was very persuasive. While I'm in the Air Force, I learned a bunch of skills, traveled the world, and eventually got out 10 years later, making $130K with the skills I learned while I was in. Prior to any of this, I had no plans and no idea what I wanted to do after high school. My entire life was changed because I didn't want to walk home on a hot summer day. Story 10. In October 1962, Nikita Khrushchev deployed a fleet of 4 submarines to Cuba, each equipped with a 15-kiloton nuclear warhead. On October 27th, a fleet of U.S. Navy destroyers located one of the Soviet submarines, known as B-59, near Cuba. Despite being in international waters, the U.S. Navy started dropping signaling depth charges to force the submarine to come to the surface. At this time, the Soviet crew had been out of contact with Moscow for several days, and the submarine was too deep to monitor U.S. civilian radio broadcasts. The submarine's batteries had run very low, and the air conditioning had failed, causing extreme heat and high levels of carbon dioxide inside the submarine. As the depth charges exploded, the captain of B-59, Valentin Savitsky, believed a war had already started and ordered the arming of the nuclear torpedo, fully intending on launching it. But also aboard B-59 was Vasily Arkhipov, who just so happened to be the commanding officer of the entire Soviet submarine fleet. After a heated argument with the captain, Arkhipov gave orders not to fire the torpedo that very likely could have caused an all-out nuclear war. Good thing Arkhipov was on that submarine. Story 11. This is a bit of a stretch, but the song "Baby It's Cold Outside" arguably was one thing that led to 9/11. An Egyptian guy named Saeed Qutbi was studying in the U.S. from 1948 to 1950 and was disgusted by what he saw as the U.S.'s permissive libertine culture. Yes, in the late 40s. Apparently couples openly holding hands in public was one reason, and that song was another. So when he went back to Egypt, he founded the Muslim Brotherhood as an organization to oppose the influence of Western decadence in the Middle East. The Egyptian military regime eventually executed him after he was linked to a plot to assassinate President Gamal Nasser, but that just made the influence of his writings greater, and the ideology spread. To give an idea how fringe it was, there's a famous video of Nasser giving a speech in the 60s, where he remarks how the MB want women to cover their heads and chuckles, and the whole room laughs too, considering that an absurd notion. Eventually, some other events led to that being the foundation of modern-day Islamism, and what influenced Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. Story 12 easily. The assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. Gavrilo Princip was recruited by the Black Hand to assassinate the Archduke, and arrived in Sarajevo to do the deed. As I recall, the assassination had failed to go as planned, as the original bomber did not succeed in killing him, and Princip managed to kill him because the Archduke's driver made a wrong turn and stalled the car right outside the bar where he was drinking to commiserate. His assassination, successfully merely by sheer luck, resulted in the start of WWI, which was responsible for the entire world we live in as a result. Story 13. If I remember correctly, there were three separate times where Adolf Hitler was a hair away from dying before he rose to power. The first two during World War I when he was enlisted. One was a man who found a young Adolf in the trenches alone near the end of the war and had him at his mercy. He decided to let him live, A, because the war was basically over, and the Solider saw no point in adding one more German body to the pile, and B, he was just so terrified, the Solider took pity on him. There is a similar story that plays out nearly exactly the same except with a sniper. I think these may just be the same story that just got jumbled up in people's memories and told in different ways though, because they are super similar. The third or second time was a time when a slightly older Adolf was living with a female friend. Apparently he was going to commit suicide, but she talked him out of it. Overall, these actions were commendable, but they led to horrible, horrible things. Story 14. At the end of WWI, while the victorious Allies were working out the language of the Treaty of Versailles, the Japanese delegation asked that language that states all races are equal be added. The French supported them, but the UK and US opposed it. To placate the Japanese, they gave German territory in China to Japan, even though China had sided with the Allies and sent 100,000 or more workers to help in France during the war. The humiliation and perceived unfairness lead to mass student protests across China known as the May 4th movement. Two of the leaders of that movement would become the founders of the CCP. Mao would later go on to say May 4th was setting the stage for the revolution. Well, now over a century later, we are living with all the consequences of having the CCP, divided Korea, communist Vietnam, and possibly the strongest rival to the Western liberal democratic world order in history. All that to keep out a sentence stating all races are equal. Story 15. The Nazi Party getting beat up by the Jewish Mafia Murder Inc. in major cities, NYC, Chicago, STL, etc. The Nazis had a strong hold on Americans during that time, especially towards Italian, Polish Americans, and Jewish people. When they came to spread their hate, Meyer Lansky and Murder Inc. would bash up their meetings and beat Nazi empathizers with baseball bats and other means of violence. If it weren't for the Mafia during that time, the Nazi Party would have a lot higher influence in America during that time. Additionally, the Mafia had so much influence on America during WW2 that the government pardoned a bunch of made men just to have access intel into Sicily during Mussolini's rule to help the Allies take over the Eastern Front. Operation Underworld. Story 16. Probably how one guy decided that he wanted people to be able to make their own decisions with what they put into their body because free will and free speech was so important to him, then posting as someone looking for shrooms on a random forum, and starting the Silk Road. The law didn't really know how to deal with it because it was just massive, like millions of users fast. Ross Ulbricht became so rich, so fast, and it changed a lot of laws pretty damn quick to get it shut down. It was a huge fuck you to the war on drugs. People were arrested, but it was just too big. Ross was arrested because he didn't hide himself well enough, and copycat websites pop up, but nothing will ever be as huge as Silk Road. No one else could have done it like that, and no other website would ever be as popular or work as well as that did. Story 17. No one really cares about a personal one, but here goes. When I was a kid, I thought it would be hilarious to prank call a family we were friends with. I was a weird kid. I asked my mom to find their number in the phone book, because I didn't know how to use it as a 7-year-old. She showed me their number, and I bookmarked it with a blue Kleenex. Months later, I haven't had supper yet, and I'm just chillin' watching TV all day while my mom slept. I got a call from my grandpa, asking to talk to my mom. I said she was sleeping. He insisted I wake her up. Would not take no for an answer. I try and go find her, but she wouldn't wake up. He instructed me to get a mirror and hold it under her nose. No fog. He then told me to hang up and call the family friend. Not 911, not the police. Didn't give me a number to use, so I went to the phone book and found their number and called them to tell them what was going on. That family adopted me about a year later and brought me through a really tough childhood where my family speculates that I wouldn't even be alive today if I had continued living with my mom. Bonus. Due to some really lengthy circumstances of where I live with my now husband, children, homeownership would have been nearly impossible for us, maybe forever. One day I was goofing around and decided to check the website for unclaimed money for myself in the state I used to live in. Obviously, I was kid way back then and wouldn't have anything. On a total whim, I searched my mom's name, found a 24-plus-year-old unclaimed life insurance policy in her name, with my now-deceased grandfather as the beneficiary. Everything in his will estate passed to me, and so, with some paperwork, I was able to get the life insurance policy from my mom. That was one of the only good things she ever did in her life, and we have a home now because of it. Story 18. The year is 1932. A newlywed couple from California, Charles and Betty Seaver, take their honeymoon in Arizona. While there, they spend one night at their hotel piano bar. The performer that night, whose name is lost to history, plays several songs of his own composition, including a love song called Scotch and Soda. The Seavers love the song. After the performance, they go up to him and ask him to write it down. He does so, and they take it home as a memento of their honeymoon. It becomes their song as a couple. Flash forward a quarter century. The Seavers now have a college-age daughter named Katie. She has started dating one of her classmates at Stanford University, a young man named Dave Guard. Mr. Guard is a talented musician with a knack for live performance. Dave and Katie's relationship advances to the point that he goes home to meet her parents, who decide to gift him their honeymoon song to support his burgeoning career. Very soon after, Dave Guard becomes internationally famous as a founding member of the Kingston Trio, the first legitimate superstars in the age right before Elvis and the Beatles. They record Scotch and Soda on their first album, which skyrockets to the top of the charts and eventually gets released as a single. They make a good faith effort to locate the original performer from that Phoenix piano bar, but they are not successful. So as a placeholder, they assign the copyright in a 50-50 split between Dave Guard and the Seaver parents. This windfall allows them to upgrade the educational opportunities for all three of their children: Katie, her sister Carol, and her teenage younger brother Tom. Tom Seaver is a talented athlete who is now able to upgrade his training. With his upgraded talent, he earns a baseball scholarship to college, where he plays 1 year before he gets drafted into the major leagues, where, as a pitcher, he leads the New York Mets to win the World Series in 1969. He gets inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame in 1992, all because his parents walked into a piano bar on their honeymoon 60 years before. Thank you very much for watching. If you liked the video, like it. Be sure to write comments and share your stories.